Although it looks like I see a 12-minute. Oh, there we go. You're recording. There we go. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I hope you had a good day. I hope people are learning stuff. We'll get right into it. I think you've seen this probably the slide in every single session so far. Just so you know, and you saw it happen, we are recording this meeting. Please mute yourself. Put the questions in the chat. I'll be here to help moderate. So if Doug doesn't see the questions, he's usually really good about catching those. I'll definitely butt in and bring them to his attention. Again, as in every session, there is a $25 gift certificate giveaway for each session, and then we are also giving away the Surface Go to the lucky person that fills out the survey at the end of the day. We want to thank all the sponsors that we have here. Hopefully you're aware of all of them at this point. I don't want to. Hey, look at you, Doug. You got Kitty in there. I don't want to take too much time because we're already 4 minutes into your time, Doug. I'll turn it over to you and go off and monitor the chat.
Yeah,
Great
no
to
worries.
see you, by the way. You're looking
good.
good.
See you as well. Thank you. And yes, I have a kitty. And I figured people could use like a couple minutes between the session just for the decompression there. I don't normally have a full 90 minutes. I like to have a little bit of time in between in case there are more complicated questions to dive into. I also usually like to try and run sessions more as a open discussion or forum just because it's way more enjoyable.
Good. So are you saying people should feel free to come off mute and ask their question right out
yeah, loud? As long as it's more reasonable, like not right in the middle of me reading a sentence or something, but if there's like a good break, I definitely encourage people to come off mute, ask a question, or ask for more information on that. It's usually how I build my designs because 90% of it is like live environment, like walking through and explaining while I'm looking at the environment.
Yep. Love it. And if you don't feel comfortable coming off mute, just feel free to use the chat and I'll bring it to Doug's attention if he doesn't see it. Sound good? I will get out of your hair, Doug, and let you go.
Perfect. See if PowerPoint will work for me. What does it mean when my computer says it does not have enough resources?
Do you have Steam running?
Always. No, it's Microsoft Edge. I have 64 gigs memory on this device, and Edge still tries to chug it all away.
It isn't. I have to say I love Edge, but it is not efficient.
Well, I don't know any browser anymore unless we want to go back to Opera. Damn. Come on, everyone, that's a joke. Got to use Microsoft Edge. That is our style.
Yes.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for one of the final session of the day. As we were talking about a few minutes ago, I encourage kind of roundtable discussion, open questions, and any communication that would be beneficial for you. Again, I want you to get as much as possible out of this session. And I also, of course, want to just thank the sponsors, as we've done in every session, but truly having sponsors as well as you as the community, it's what makes our user group possible. We are here for the community, trying to share knowledge or just encourage discussion on what we do from day to day. For anybody who does not know me, my name is Doug Wilson. I'm on the board of this user group. I am webmaster. So try to make the join links and everything else around the website as user-friendly as possible. I work for CDW. I'm a senior consulting engineer there. I am also an MVP in the enterprise mobility area. On Twitter, I'm not super active, but I am at ManageDoug, and my professional headshot is this picture here, actually. So try to keep that in use as much as possible. Our focus today is going to be around configuring conditional access from a lot of scenarios that I currently see, as well as common recommendations, a walkthrough of configuring a lot of these policies, where Microsoft is at with some of the configurations, and how we can leverage them and do a layered approach. So objectives, complete like the main core objectives, just understanding the high level of what zero trust is. It is still a thing as much as everybody uses that buzzword nowadays. It is still a very good principle to follow. Um, and then planning conditional access policies and how do we configure and how do we even test conditional access policies? So if we have 5 of them set to a user, how are we figuring that out? And then making sure our policies are always able to verify user access. So again, we're focused on that zero trust, and the main principles to follow is verify explicitly. So one of the key factors here is pretty much wherever a signal is coming from, whether that's the application through a device, we want to verify that identity to make sure it is approved, like trusted. If it has not been trusted, if it doesn't meet any of the requirements, it's going to do a validation depending on our settings or block that access. Always recommended for least privilege access. There are features within the E5 licensing that does more of the JIT or just enough access. So Microsoft Azure PIM is the Privileged Identity Manager, and that's a higher level of licensing there. It is very beneficial for managing administrative accounts or making sure users aren't always fully at that administrative level. And lastly, one of the core things is assume your environment's been breached. I think that's been kind of a basis for a very long time now. It's just what we should expect. It's not always something to panic about. Don't spend the next 40 hours without sleeping trying to resolve it, but it's something to start building. How do we protect our identities? How do we protect our environment? When we're looking at zero trust, some of the defense zones that we can look at to be protecting our identities, again, that's verifying and securing identities with our strong authentication applications. We should be looking at utilizing things like Cloud App Discovery, or sorry, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, to help monitor for any shadow IT, which could be considered like unapproved applications in the environment if we allow anybody to add applications. Um, Infrastructure, so being able to block risky behavior and again, employing that least privilege access. Endpoints, so tying right into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, ensure compliance and health status on devices to access certain applications or resources. Data using labeling or other information protection policies to help protect that. And then networking, again, utilizing services like Microsoft Defender for Cloud to actually monitor where users are connecting to or protecting them depending on how they're connecting. Sorry for the bright slide. Microsoft really likes very bright and white slide backgrounds. Gets everyone's attention clearly, or makes sure you're awake at least. And looking at this, so one of the main things to understand about conditional access is these are assigned to accounts or identities within Azure. And we are validating or verifying them from the signal they come in through. So it could be the location that you're coming in from, a device you're coming in from, a resource or a document you're trying to access, or even the application you're trying to access. And verifying does encompass things like MFA, uh, being able to limit access on that. So depending on what signal or your like what your account meets is going to be how we verify or block or limit controls against your account. So that's where allow access comes in, or forcing you to MFA, or only giving you limited capabilities in an application, or if your account's high risk, which we'll go into and over a little bit, requiring your account to even do a password reset. And then, of course, once you pass through that verify, you'll have access to what is ever assigned to you. So looking at it, diving right into some of the material, conditional access assignments. And I will actually get one of my environments up and about. So when we're looking at conditional access assignments, going to bring this over, make sure that I'm actually sharing my entire monitor so you can see it real quick. Give me one moment. Yeah, and it should be more than just the PowerPoint. You should be able to see my browser. If anybody could give me a thumbs up just to make sure that it's sharing before I start going into it. Perfect, thank you, Ted. So my main portal I use everything from is still going to be portal.azure.com. You could do this from the Azure AD portal as well. I just tend to access more than just Azure Active Directory, so this works. To get into our conditional access and start reviewing the high level of what we have, we'll go under Azure Active Directory, Security, and then under Protect, we have our conditional access. You can see I have a number of policies in here already, but we're going to start at the very top and look at creating a new policy just to walk through what the separation here is. I guess one other thing I wouldn't mind getting, could I get either a show of hands or something in chat? How many people are actively managing their security and environment with conditional access? There's one person, two, perfect. Of those hands raised, how many currently have MFA for all users configured? Hey, that's not bad. That's pretty good. Hey, somehow we gained more hands from that as well. I'm okay with that. Improvement always. Thank you all. So what is really important here when we're reviewing conditional access and assignments of our environment, we have our user and workloads, our cloud apps or actions, and our conditions. We need to start planning out what we're going to be assigning here. So what is going to be under the assignment? How does this apply to our user environment? And sometimes it's really important to ask the right questions. And Microsoft does provide a decent amount of documentation on this. So not everything is fully written down, but the overall idea is, so when we're looking at this, we have our user groups, or even in preview at the moment is workload identities. For this, I'm only focusing on users and groups. Sometimes I do like applying to all users just to make sure we don't miss anyone. But what's really important about that review is, does this actually need to apply to external users as well? Do our security groups within Azure, are they going to cover all our users? One of the main things is we don't want to apply a security policy, like a restriction or requirement for MFA, if it misses some of the critical end users or our standard users. So that's usually where I will say it's a great idea to do it against all users, but then make sure we're excluding areas that don't want this policy. If we don't do this against end users, again, that's one of the main questions. Which users and groups will be included or excluded from the policy? So if we are including all users, say we're making a MFA for all users at the moment, a few key things to exclude, especially if we're working on testing this, would be a break glass account. Now, again, maybe I could get another show of hands here. How many people have break glass accounts configured in their tenant? I'm guessing it might be the same for people who've used conditional access. Okay. So when we're working with Azure, I do want to cover that while we're going through this. One of the most critical things, and my break glass is not a good break glass. It is my overall admin and owner of the tenant. The break glass account is the most important account in your Azure environment, just because if MFA fails or if MFA goes down temporarily with Microsoft, how do you gain access to your tenant, or how do you recover anything in your tenant if you lose access to your other global administrator accounts. So this account's going to have that global administrator right. We don't want this to have any restriction policies on it. All that means though then is that we will want to make sure that we audit this account and make sure there's a very secure password. It's not just summer or I missed summer 2021 or can't wait for summer 2022. So then this would again at the moment cover all users, exclude our break glass account. If we're using anything such as Azure AD Connect, you might need to be excluding that synchronization service account as well. Or if we're trying to do a different control against guest users, we may even have another control there. Next, so we have this going against all users. Our next one that we'll look at is our cloud apps and actions. So understanding the cloud app or actions within conditional access. This is going to be what's available. This is going to be applications that are actually configured in Azure Active Directory under your, your enterprise applications. So things like Office 365 or other capabilities that have been added in, SSO applications that have been added in. Some examples I've been seeing more and more actually have been your VPN applications such as Cisco AnyConnect for requiring MFA every time you connect with it. For general MFA though, I'll again usually look at doing all cloud apps. And the reason I look at this, if I'm not doing anything too advanced or breaking this out too much at the moment, I want all cloud apps because no matter what that user is authenticating through, I want to make sure they are prompted correctly for MFA. Now, if there's an application that we can't use MFA against or account that can't use MFA against, that's where we can also exclude those applications. I don't see that very often, but there is that ability. And then there is another capability here. If we're not, instead of targeting all cloud apps, we could be potentially also looking at user registration during device joins. And we'll make another policy for that and review another policy. And that's where we'll have user action. So I just want to make sure no one calls me out for skipping that at the moment. And then as we get into conditions, so our conditions are going to be, when is this what signals or what is causing this condition, or is everything included in this policy? So we have the application that comes through, like if it's happening during this application authentication, and then we can select potentially, does this only apply to condition like a signal coming from Windows or from mobile devices? Additionally, so in some of your environments, you may not see these top two options, and I call these out again because these are E5 licensing. They actually tie into your Azure Identity Protection. And we will cover that in a little bit. But the rest of these controls, device platforms, these are really beneficial when trying to either control how users authenticate on varying devices. Usually we're more restrictive on the desktop or Windows and Mac platforms, and maybe a little less restrictive on the mobile platforms with MFA. And that could be just because we have other protection policies on there, or there's more bring your own device capabilities and configured there. Again, for my environment, though, I'm going to say any device. So if I don't configure this, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be required against any device here. So it's going to happen no matter where it comes from. Additionally, we have our locations. So locations, we could potentially do exclusions where MFA is not required. It's not recommended just to have that as one selection, but you can do a location where we say, yes, we trust anybody at my home office. So if you are within the home office IP range, your account does not get prompted for MFA then. It works great, again, for office locations or trusted locations during maybe a user registration to bypass that MFA for the moment. But again, right on its own, I'll usually recommend if you're doing a location, we should have additional rules such as the device being compliant or the device being enrolled into our MDM of Intune, just to make sure we have better verification there. Client applications. So we have two main capabilities here of controlling that authentication and what we'll be focusing on. I believe it was in mid to end of 2020, Microsoft actually made a change to conditional access where by default, if you don't have this configured, this policy will apply to all forms of authentication. So that's modern and legacy. The main area to call out with the legacy authentication is going to be that these are forms of authentication that really don't support things like MFA. So the standard recommendation, especially for cloud application access, is looking at blocking legacy authentication in our environment. That does include things like Exchange ActiveSync. Most modern browsers do support the modern authentication. My normal recommendation, though, anyways, is you should be forcing users to use the Outlook application just because we have more controls around that. So by default right now, we could leave this as not configured just for our general MFA policy, and it will apply to no matter what the user's coming through. Of course, again, legacy auth, it doesn't matter if we don't check it or not because it's not going to make a difference if they come through there right now. And I do want to explain the last two options here, device state and and filter for devices. I'll cover this right here with these information icons. They're really helpful when we're going through the environment because Microsoft usually does provide a decent definition there. It's not always defined just by its own word. Again, I'm sure we have seen those throughout the environment. I encounter them often, but for the most part, they're helpful. Why I'm bringing this device state up right now, though, is because it's being deprecated. We should no longer be using device state in our conditional access policy. So if anybody on the call does have device state configured, which is really around that is the device hybrid or AD joined or mark compliant, we need to start moving that over to filter for devices. Now, the device filtering, definitely I prefer that. It gives us a lot more capability. So where this becomes really beneficial is that user experience, especially around moving to a rolling MFA design. So in here, I could say exclude. So MFA for all, I can say, actually, if my device is compliant, which is going to be is compliant equals true here. I could also say, and the device is joined to Azure Active Directory. And we actually have those in dropdown, so I don't have to type anything. Then be excluded from this policy. So then if I'm logging in with a account on a Azure AD joined device that is compliant in Intune, it will not be, my account should not be impacted by this specific conditional access policy. Doesn't mean if I have a layered policy approach, which I'll show, that I won't be affected by another one, but this is a very, very, very strong way, especially for device management, to implement better user experiences. Because again, as we're going through more security and managing trust here for our accounts, we're trying to lock everything down. We don't want to make the end user experience horrible. And that's kind of the route some environments go before really starting to lean into conditional access. Going into our grant controls, or our access controls, pardon me. Going into our access controls, we have the ability for grant and block. So blocking access is definitely one of my more fun ones. If you ever get upset with one of your coworkers, go ahead and just assign a policy that just always blocks their account from logging in. It's very, very fun. And before I continue, I do see, I don't know if the hands are up are from earlier still, or if you have an active question. If you don't, I'll continue here. If you do, feel free to come off mute. And I'm actually going to step back one slide because I do see a question on, or a comment on the filter for devices here from Sean. His question is, we've had problems using filter for devices. Seems like some browsers, Edge, Chromium, don't return device info or partial device info. Sean, that is a very, very fun topic that I've spent probably 10 to 15 hours going through and even working with Microsoft on. And it's going to be it depends on how your device is configured and how your user is configured. If you want, towards the end of this session, I can actually dive a little bit more into it because that actually ties into your user's primary refresh token associated to the device. And that actually, I'm very happy you brought that up because these types of filters do require the user actually be registered to the device. So that might answer your question or your issues you've run into. So right now, with filter-free devices, if I log into a kiosk device, it doesn't matter what browser I'm using. If I log into like a kiosk device that I'm not associated to, so I didn't log into it, I just open a browser and try and log into that browser, I'm not on a compliant device. That, like, it's not under my user ID, my name is not registered on that computer. So it's not going to work in that sense to do a filter. If that, I don't know if that answers your concern, Sean. Otherwise, towards the end, if I have more time, I'll cover that more. Going into our grant controls. So again, we have our block and grant controls. Where this block control starts becoming really powerful is if we do risk or need to block legacy authentication. So again, if we are actually going back up, looking at some of our conditions, and we want to block, one of the main recommendations actually going through our environment, and I'll show kind of how to identify if we have this issue in your environments, is blocking legacy authentication. There are still applications that require it, but using conditional access, we can really start bolstering some of our base securities by blocking that. So looking at this, if we go to our client apps here, we don't have to have anything else configured here at the moment unless there's a unique exclusion we need. We can go in, select if any signal is coming in from a cloud application that is using a legacy authentication client or protocol there, we'll say that. So this policy would affect all users coming in through the client apps with legacy authentication. And then we can go to our grant control and block it. And if I say that, now if I tried logging in through a browser or something that doesn't support modern authentication, it's just going to block me. I'm going to fail that login. I'm going to get a prompt that says you're unable to log in. You've been blocked. Contact IT. Out of the users again that are running with conditional access, how many of you have legacy authentication being blocked that way? Or you may have a brand new tenant that already has legacy authentication disabled. Do you have security defaults on? That is disabled in security defaults. Then one of the last ones before we start getting into too much of the policy layering and kind of really like beneficial approaches is going to be our session, our access controls and that session control. There are a number of those throughout here. Again, using app enforcement restrictions, that's going to be able to tie in if we have controls set up in Exchange or SharePoint against those applications, just to limit user configurations. Those aren't as common for, honestly, with me configuring those in the environments right now. So I'm not going to do a deep dive there today. The main ones that I want to cover are going to be sign-in frequency or persistent browser. If there's other questions, let me know. But otherwise, I think, again, these are probably the two more common ones that I'm seeing most environments looking at. So sign-in frequency, this is going to be, depending on the device you're using, it's going to be how often do you have to relog in. Now, this may be really familiar. for people who are, let me actually change a slide here. For people who are currently logging in through a browser or in private windows. And I'll show this. It will let me go over to it. So there's two super high resolution items here. And the sign-in request. I'm curious, is anyone running into or is anyone using session control right now with conditional access to try and limit how often users are logging into a device or a browser session? Yep. So one issue, if you are configuring potentially MFA as well as session controls, I'm seeing customers that get these double prompts. So when you're logging into a session, I get one prompt that's approve sign-in request and don't ask again for 14 days. And then I get a second prompt that says, do you want to stay signed in to this browser? Like, hey, make this a better experience. This by itself together is a bad user experience, and we want to avoid that. Some people want to have both though, and that's perfectly fine if we have a lot of unique controls out there, but I'm going to show where that is actually handled, and that ties again into that user experience that we care a lot about, especially around session controls. So again, our session controls, we can configure that for hours or days, and then persistent browser, that is going to be when you're logged in through a web browser, do we allow that token to always be there, so that user login token until it expires? Or for kiosk devices, if we're going to restart or refresh that profile after like 30 minutes of no use or no activity, or if the user closes the browser when they're done, if we have an application that they go through a test and it closes, we might look at doing a never persistent session. So no matter what, every time that browser closes, it doesn't keep that login token. So the browser sessions, very beneficial, especially around kiosk management or terminal type devices users might be configuring. Sign-in frequency, I've been starting to use this to replace I don't really think it's a legacy portal, but I really hate the portal and I hope it goes away, to replace the other MFA controls. So now in this environment here, I have quite a number of policies configured across my accounts. So I'd like to start kind of covering standard controls that we should be looking at, especially for your environment. The first one, again, in almost any environment, we should be looking at blocking legacy authentication. And one of the biggest benefits of using conditional access is if you turn this on, you don't have to assign this to every single user immediately. We can do an approach where I'm assigning security groups of users, or even if I really can't, I can assign this to one user at a time, probably not the AD sync server. But like I could apply it to some of my fake accounts here. I don't even know what the automate bot is. Not a bot. I'm trying to find real user accounts. So I could assign it to a few test users. Depending on the size of your organization, there are limits to direct memberships here, as well as nested group memberships that are supported with these assignments. It is always recommended to just assign, again, security groups here rather than direct memberships, but for a one-off test, it's perfectly fine to do this. And then that authentication, as we go through, we can look at our conditions. Again, our application. So my recommendation is all cloud apps. We should be running this against anything through Azure that our identity might authenticate through. If there was truly one we needed to exclude, we could exclude it, but I would even almost want to break that out and have a different policy that would allow it for other users. Or block it for all users except the ones that need it. And then conditions. So looking at conditions, client applications, I have it configured, and we have legacy authentication clients for Exchange ActiveSync clients and other clients configured. A note about cloud applications. I've tried getting more understanding of why, but if you are doing a policy just against the Exchange ActiveSync clients, it is highly recommended, and I think still required, that we adjust this cloud apps to actually just be Exchange ActiveSync in the cloud applications list. So instead of doing out cloud apps, we would just target that because that is the only service this impacts. And talking about the other areas, the device state preview, which is deprecated, and then filter for devices. I don't want to filter. I don't want to exclude things from here. I want to block all access. So it is blocked. I doesn't matter if I have require one of the selected or all of the selected, no matter what application you are accessing there, if it's considered legacy auth or a other client, it will be blocked and you will not be able to log into that service. Now, with Azure Active Directory, a great way that we can actually help identify if our environment has legacy authentication. And this is also a way we could start building our plan. Here's our users, or here's our applications that use legacy authentication that we might need to remediate or see if we can improve upon the change. So sometimes that does require working with a vendor or a third party to remediate that, to review it. So if we go to Azure Active Directory under our users, the simplest way that's usually already configured for us is going to be sign-in logs. And then we have our add filters. And we'll look at our client app here. So going through our client applications, there's a lot of them. I always wish there's just like a select all, but legacy authentication clients. Here's everything that's considered legacy authentication that doesn't support modern auth apps or modern auth like MFA. So if I select all, my environment, because I've had it blocked and honestly it's still a test lab, so it doesn't have great data in here at the moment. There's nothing in here. But if you run this in your environment, then honestly, it's harmless to run just this query there looking for legacy client apps. And again, last 7 days, or you can change this filter. That will show you if any user accounts or service accounts are logging in with legacy auth. So if we do have critical apps that are made that way, we could exclude those, again, those applications or those accounts, or we can start doing a proof of concept / pilot of blocking everything and just slowly rolling that out across user groups. Any questions on blocking legacy auth or reviewing that? I'm supposed to ask questions so I can have a water break. Come on. No. So continuing on. There are standard lists out there of here's general recommended MFA policies, but my whole theory around best practice is not everybody's environment is the same best practice. We want to make sure that any configurations we're doing would be a best practice for your environment. So if one person is using session controls, other people may not be. So that will come. So that brings us back around to our other session controls, back to the screen behind here, looking at these two session control like two MFA and session control experience. This is again at login when users are authenticated. Now I have two session controls on here, just again, mainly for extreme examples or common examples. Dennis also put in there about the default refresh, like PRT or refresh token being 90 days for a user on a device. So I do set just the default 90 days. So if I'm looking at this, I have two MFA session controls. I don't normally want multiple MFAs against the same user if they're going to contradict each other or cause any experience issue. So that these other MFAs, like MFA for all users, I'm not going to use if I have one of these session controls assigned to that user as well, because this will cause them to MFA, but in a way that we want that's a better experience. So one of the standard ones, and this does again require a couple other settings, which I'll cover just to make sure, again, with the sign-in frequency, as well as utilizing Intune and Intune's compliance. So I have all users included except maybe my break glass account or other high-risk account. All users will be required to MFA. Cloud apps, that's wrong. I have to have it against all cloud apps. And then if we look at our conditions, so again, device platforms, I'm going to say any device, you don't need to. But what I'm calling out here is workstation. So I'm going to be breaking out my policy for workstation and mobile device platforms just to have a potentially a different experience for that user, or to try and manage them differently. MFA on a mobile device is sometimes a little excessive depending on what that is accessing on it. So compliant workstations. So that's where I have, it's going to include pretty much any device, but then I'll exclude iOS and Android. And the reason I'm doing that is I just want to make sure that's covering anything that's compliant and Intune that's not iOS or Android. Technically, yeah, I see that has Windows Phone in there. Please, honestly, we should just make a policy that says block access from Windows phones for any application, because there's no way that's secure anymore. So this will be against Windows or Mac OS, so any of the workstations there. And then if we look at our filter for devices, what we're going to set up in here is enable this. And this policy is going to actually include. So we're going to include is compliant equals true. So then if the configuration on this device is compliant in Intune, and it's accessing any of these applications, it will come through and do a session control. And then we also will want to say you're going to have to MFA on that, but that's going to actually create it to be a rolling MFA. So sign-in frequency of 90 days. So if we look at this time period before a user is asked to sign in again when attempting to access a resource, default is 90 days. Depending on the authentication method, so some of the like FIDO2 keys or Windows Hello for Business actually will cause this to become a rolling authentication or a rolling frequency, or rolling sign-in, meaning that if I lock my computer, reboot my computer, sign in with a FIDO2 key or USB, this 90-day window actually is reset on that computer then. If I don't log in that way, or I don't have one of those factors, it's going to continue until I log into another application or relog into an application with that capability. Now, the other one here is our MFA session control non-compliant workstations. Similar conditions, any device, so any of the workstations. It's just opposite now. So I'm just excluding compliant devices from Intune. So it's going to include everything else. And a grant access require MFA, sign-in frequency every hour. That's pretty brutal. I think a lot of my clients are probably closer to like 7 days or so without that, just because again, they're MFAing. It's kind of that standard one. But it's a lab. I like to make it hectic for me when I'm trying to re-authenticate in an application. A few notes again around that session control to make sure that is working for our environment. We go into our users. We do need a configuration enabled for them. And that's going to be under our Azure Active Directory users, user settings, and our user feature settings. Sorry if I went a roundabout way there. It's just the standard route I go. And my tenant's newer, so this is actually forced on by default. Some of your tenants, if they've been around a bit longer, this might be at none or just selected if you're starting to test it. So I definitely recommend looking into actually starting. If you have this at none, please put it to selected, add a pilot group and start adding users into that to see that experience. And then if comfortable, move it to all, just so you can gain more capabilities around that, like again, that session control. Now, the big question, getting rid of the dual prompt here. Because honestly, I don't really want users saying, oh, hey, I don't have to get asked again for 14 days. I'd rather they just hit stay signed in after a period of non-use or non-reauthentication. It's going to just reprompt. And how we can manage that here is going in through security. And if we go to our MFA, additional cloud-based MFA settings. I don't like this portal. It's old. ActiveDirectory.windowsazure.com site still. And it's going to be here. So looking at this again, even the little note here that Microsoft has this, if we're using sign-in frequency, if we want to keep this going, we can set this, make sure that this is at least at that highest level day for a user that it could be. just to make sure, because again, that sign frequency would force that to re-authenticate anyways. But if we don't want the double prompt, we can look at actually disabling that, removing that. And then if the device doesn't have anything, it may require them to re-authenticate with that MFA. So that would enable us to have that rolling MFA now on a device. If we kept that enabled, it should still force them to actually re-MFA no matter what at that period, rolling or not. Going back into our conditional access policies. So we'd have several policies built here. Then we would have our block legacy authentication, our MFA with session control if we want to go that route. And those are all capable to be done with the standard E3 or A3 or G3 licensing that I'm aware of. Not sure again, depending on the government tenant level of what is enabled there, because I haven't reviewed that for a little bit, but I know sometimes they're a little behind. A couple of the higher licensing features I do want to cover are going to be around the blocking and sign-in risk. And it's just going to be a quick high level of it. We're not going into configuring identity protection or anything in Azure right now. But if we're looking at this, we have special conditions at this top here. This is going to be based on sign-in risk. Bring that up actually. So again, looking at this, the sign-in risks, that is more focused around if you're like the probability, or if Azure thinks that your authentication request isn't going to be authorized by the owner, or if it looks suspicious when you're trying to authenticate in. And then let's see, yes, I have that. Sorry, that's, yeah, sign-in risk. I'm just getting it mixed up. User risk, that's going to be if Azure believes that your account or identity is compromised. If it thinks that it's compromised or knows that it's been compromised, we should honestly block that access. And I don't want, when we're blocking this, especially those risks, I normally don't want to allow self-user remediation. I mean, again, each environment's a little different, but I'd prefer the user to have to reach out to IT or our help desk to make sure that their account is set up correctly or renewed correctly, or depending on what's been compromised there. We can see that information within Azure AD or identity protection if we review those logs. Now, the user risk, depending on if the authentication's having issues. Let's see. We look at user risk here. Now, user risk being a little bit differently, again, based on if authentication is not working, or maybe somebody was trying to use a password spray attack against their accounts, we can block it or require that the end user's account will have to have a password change. This also requires you to have MFA against that account. So it's going to require the user to MFA and then change their password, and that can be done automatically. Definitely one of the recommended features to take advantage of. Just because, again, it's one less thing that we as IT may have to worry about then. Now, going into closer to that, the general, when people are talking zero trust, because it's really built around a lot of the device configurations. We've talked about device compliance within Intune, and we can do all of that with mobile device, but we also have a lot of environments where we might be looking at just doing application management. So how do we protect a device that's coming into our environment that only has application protection? So we don't necessarily want the user to join it to be enrolled in Intune. We might only want that user to have the device registered, and then they can access applications. That's perfectly fine for most environments. So we have another policy, and this is going to be for, I actually will recommend it for workstations as well. Let's see. I have too many items in here. So I'm going to create a new policy actually, because I don't see it. And this is going to be our device registration. So this would be against all users. And what we're looking to do with this policy is going to be any device that's comes into Intune will have to, any device that you're authenticating a service through should be registered. It actually ties back into that PRT of the user. So when you register a device, you're actually getting a token assigned to that. If you're not doing it, it won't hit this policy. But then, so if I'm taking my mobile phone, installing Outlook, and trying to get to my email, it will come through here. We're doing all cloud apps, and then conditions, or I'm sorry, not all cloud apps. We're doing device registration. This is going to be a user action. So when a user registers or joins a device into Azure Active Directory, so this could be during autopilot as well, we can require certain controls. So I would say that requires MFA. So for the first time when you come through here, we're requiring MFA. A lot of these conditions, if we want to have any exception, like if we really needed to have a secure location that's exempted, we could do that. We could have other triggers based on the platform for it if we only want that on mobile phones or workstations again. For the most part, though, I'll just say it requires MFA to do this. And that is actually the preferred method to control device registration versus the other location that you might see again when you're configuring a tenant or working in your Active Directory. So again, back in the top level of Azure AD, if we go under devices and go to look at device settings, there's this box here that is require MFA to register or join devices with Azure AD. Now, this can be, it is preferred to use conditional access, and there are a number of these types of capabilities throughout Azure AD where you're able to do a box and say everything, but if you do have conditional access licensing, which starts with Azure AD P1, it is much better to do that. We have more controls, better piloting capabilities or testing capabilities. So we wouldn't set it here, and we would configure that then in conditional access. Once we have the device being registered or that requirement for the device to be registered, that takes care of kind of that verify or validate when the user's logging into the device. But this is not forcing the user to register that device, though. It's not forcing a mobile phone to enroll in Intune or to register in Azure AD. Where we can do more of those controls is going to be our application management or our MDM app protection or MDM controls. So starting at the higher level, where we're not going to require users to enroll a phone into Intune, we just want to do application protection policies on it. We'll look at doing just, again, all users, or if we only allow certain user groups to do mobile application management, we could select or specify those user groups. Again, I do it against all cloud applications just to help control that. And then conditions, what I'm looking at here, I want to look at our device platforms. So we're doing this for mobile devices. I'm not doing this against Windows or Mac. There are some capabilities you can do there, but for these policies, anything that I'm doing against phones, I only keep it as mobile phones. And I don't want to, again, include Windows Phone. And then locations, I'm not doing anything in locations because I don't care where you're at when you're doing this. And then client applications, I'm looking at doing the mobile apps and desktop clients. So where that becomes important, again, if you're going through the browser and your device isn't trusted, you'll get that MFA session control one again. Or if your device is compliant and trusted, you would get that 90-day session control. But for applications, I just want to manage this a little bit differently. And it would go through here. And what the next part is going to be our grant controls. What we're going to do is require approved client apps or an application protection policy. So within Intune, there are application protection profiles that can be assigned out by that administrator, and we can require those if they're available for the application, or if they're not, we can actually go through and see a list of here's what's approved right now. Unless it's not a complete list, but this is the known list that Microsoft will publish of what's approved and will work. So doing an approved client approach like this does actually help us control. You can't use unsupported applications we don't want, or if you wanted to force users to use Outlook over the default iOS mail app, which is a very common one because we want to do more protections, we enable that policy on devices. Any questions on the MAM policy there? Otherwise, we'll continue on. To be able to force enrollment of a device, and we could do this against Windows as well. What we want to do is actually do, again, configure our device platforms we want to target again. Because I'm doing mobile on here, I'll target Android and iOS. Client apps, again, I could say either or depending on what I want. So if I want to actually manage it, no matter how it's logging in, let's target those. And then what's important, how we can start forcing them to enroll in Intune is doing a grant control and saying you require this device to be marked compliant. This is going to force them to, well, enroll in Intune because that's the only way a device can be marked compliant. At the bottom here, just to kind of cover these multiple control options here, if we do require one of the selected controls, it's an or statement. So if we were to say like MFA or device to be compliant, so if the device is compliant, you should not have the MFA on that device. Okay. I want to cover a few other areas here, if it will let me. Deck. So Microsoft has these items published here, like the common conditional access policies. I never want you to be limited just by what is common or the general recommendation because I want it to always fit your needs of your environment. There are good security practices, and I've gone through quite a few of them today, but Microsoft has some of these listed out, like again, MFA for administrative roles. It's actually a really good policy to have, and I do have that built out. And I actually want to showcase if we're not working with those policies yet or conditional access, Microsoft has an ability to has actually made it templates. It's in preview at the moment. They've provided templates to help us out. So if we go through, we are going to do something with identities, and they have a lot of options up here now. So they have all users. Again, I like to modify that a little bit from their template just to be a little bit better of a user experience. Where is that? So the main one, though, is going to be require MFA for admins. That's the most critical one we have. Anybody with high-level administrative rights in the environment, we should require them to MFA through Azure. Definitely one of the biggest core goals we could have there. And as we look at this, I have that policy right here, MFA for admins. You'll see there's a few naming conventions throughout here. I will always just recommend try and make a naming convention that kind of helps you identify what these policies are. It'll be very important for troubleshooting or reviewing what's applying to a user if they have issues. But MFA for admins, what's really nice here is there's select users and groups and then directory roles. So I can just say anybody assigned to these types of roles will have this apply to them. It's much better than trying to say, well, do I have a security group for each of them? And you absolutely might, but if you don't, we can select the role so anybody who gets added in there immediately gets this policy. And any application they log into will always require them to MFA through. One of the last areas I did want to cover with our policies is also our security registration. So handling users registration for MFA, normally if we do require an MFA policy for an end user, it's going to prompt them to register for MFA. It's going to bring up your organization requires more information. If you are using security defaults, you may get an option that says, go ahead and skip this for the next 14 days on your login. But if we want to override that or do anything different and we use conditional access, we can set up a policy that says, nope, when the user registers, or when the user logs into any application, it's going to require them to provide more information and register for MFA. We can lock that down even further. And I know this might not be possible for every environment, but right now what we can look at here again, so under user actions here, we have register security information. Under conditions, it's not going to, it doesn't work here at the moment, but pretty much any device. For our grant controls, actually that is set up wrong. That's interesting. This should be no. So this is going to be on any device. And then if we go to here, it's going to be require MFA. So what's interesting here is, so I'm requiring a user to MFA, like to register for MFA because they may not have it yet, but I'm also going to say they require that MFA capability. Now, that just helps actually start protecting that account by default. Where this actually can work if we configure it is going into conditions and saying, we have a trusted location that the user is going to have to be at to do that registration. Again, not every environment will work on this, but if we have a very secure area that users have to go to do this at, we can require them to do it during a training or depending on the environment. There's also another capability within Azure AD now that we can create an exception for a period of time where it goes around MFA. So if a user can't MFA or when they get a device and are working with somebody kind of walking them through that like their first time setup, we can make that exception and say, hey, for the next 5 minutes, you don't need to MFA when you do anything. So if it requires MFA, it'll basically bypass this. That's rather difficult to do depending on how many users you're onboarding a day, but that is a capability to help lock this down further and protect it. Additionally, you may see there are options at the bottom here when I'm configuring these. We have our enable policy, so report only, on or off. If we want to just monitor an environment and see if it would affect users, we can do report only. So I could actually deploy a require MFA to all my users in the environment and just say report only. If that is your goal, just please make sure it's report only. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad day when everybody has to MFA. The next area that I think I'll look at closing up with is going to be how do we understand or review what kind of conditional access is applied to the users. How do we review or troubleshoot that even? If I can find the right browser. There's probably a reason why my computer always runs out of memory when I have browsers open. I have 5 profiles open at the moment, and each of the tabs has about 10 of their own tabs open. So there's probably 50 tabs open across 4 or 5 profiles. Loves it. So again, the main area that we'll be looking at is our user sign-in information. And I will add, you can definitely build onto the Azure AD reporting by going through like log analytics. Let's go ahead and I'll go to users. So under users, again, I have the preview features on, which is usually just a newer UI, but our sign-in logs. So the same place I mentioned about viewing legacy authentication, we can view how the users authenticate, like logging in. So this is my account when it's logging in. I have a test user called M365, super generic and very, very great. But I had to create a test user just to get some data in here. Sometimes when you do logins and are trying to pull data from a pilot user account, it can actually take 5 to 10 minutes for that login report to actually come into this log, just FYI. So if you come in here like a minute after you log into a device, you may not see anything change. So our kind of the overview of the sign-in log here is going to be basic information. It gives us quite a lot of it gives us a lot of, well, basic information, but around the sign-in, what happened, where the user logged in from, the status, did it fail, did it succeed, and why did it fail? The session has expired or is invalid due to sign-in frequency checks by CA. Application, Microsoft Office, or home office in that case. Client application was through the browser. Token issuer was from Azure AD. If I go to location, yep, that is my dedicated IP that my provider is so generous to give me for free out of Minneapolis. And then the access was Microsoft Edge. And if anybody's not familiar yet, if you use Google Chrome or a couple other browsers out there, you need to have a extension built added on to support SSO or these sign-in capabilities. Because when you're logging into this browser, this type of review does require that PRT token, it's a little redundant there, that primary refresh token to be assigned to the device and user. So pulling this compliance is because this device had a PRT on it, and it manages checking, is it managed by Intune, but it is not compliant. Authentication details goes a little bit further. Policies applied for this device, session lifetime policy applied. Gives a little more details around there and any results here and kind of what happened there. But then there's a question in chat from Dennis as well about all the user receiving a single, all users receiving a single CA policy based on, I don't know if there's another report that would show it all besides just going into your conditional access and seeing who it is assigned to. I'd have to look more into that. But my sign-in details, I can see all CAs assigned to a user profile from their sign-in logs. So this will show me everything that is applied, like everything that could be applied to this account. So all of these conditional access profiles were actually reviewed when I logged into this browser. A lot of these were not applied because it didn't actually meet any conditions. Again, I have my session control 90-day and my session control 1 hour. My device wasn't compliant, so I got hit by this one and not this one. And then if I have any that are report only, it'll show me information like success or not applied again for if they would apply to my profile. That is one of the better and easier ways to verify if conditional access is working. There is one last capability I do want to show as well with conditional access. And that's going to be this what if capability. It does not, the reason I don't jump to this right away is because it's not always, doesn't always work. But I can do what if and kind of build out a scenario. So users there, cloud app, I'll say any cloud app. I could put an IP if I want to test it against a location, if it's trusted or not. I can do it against a device platform. Again, any other application, so like mobile apps, browser, and I'll just again say pretty much anything. Don't really care. Device state, we should not be using device state anymore just because again, that is deprecated and going away. Sign-in risk, user risk, we can validate against that if we meet any of them. So again, depending on what we want. But then we have filter for devices. This is the biggest one I've been using a lot recently to try and do more trust modeling and make a better user experience with that session control. Is compliant equals true. An issue I keep seeing, it's going to say that these apply. This 1 hour applies. Interesting. I think I have that written correctly too. I have had an issue where these policies do work appropriately, but they don't come through what if correctly. So what if won't always doesn't always report correctly with the filter for devices. Even if configuring some of these other capabilities around the application it's coming through. If we do any of the other stuff, it usually doesn't change that around. So it's still the same one no matter what I do. So that's just an FYI why I usually use the sign-in logs over this. It was very, very long-winded, a lot of information. Conditional access is a lot of fun. It's just, again, making sure we plan out, really identify our user groups or security groups to kind of roll these policies out to, make sure we're covering all of our users. I have a few other things I can show if there aren't any questions at the moment before we wrap up. And Dennis did put in chat the actual name of the Chrome extension. Thank you, Dennis. I'm not on Chrome very often, so I rarely have to install that. One cool feature within Azure I'll show real quick. Again, it's just kind of around the security recommendations. It actually will tell us information over like the past 7 days or so of if we're missing users during our configurations, or again, no user, like one user with no policies applied to them. That could be an issue. 100% of sign-ins lack MFA requirements because I had MFA disabled in my tenant temporarily. So, and this will actually go through and show us sign-in events that didn't have MFA applying to it. So if we go to our conditional access, there's no MFA applied to this or even being really enforced. And then of course, policy snapshot, other reporting capabilities there. With that, I'll go to this slide of me and the cat again. I don't have, my cat ran off, so I don't have her that I can hold in front of the camera anymore. I apologize for that. But I definitely appreciate everybody's time and being here. And please, if you have questions or want to come off mute, talk it through anything or talk through any scenarios, please let me know. There was that question earlier from, let me find it, Sean, about the PRT. If you wanted to dive into that at all on the device, I could talk more through that.
I think people have been posting stuff in the chat that's been pretty helpful and answer a few of my questions. So if you want to dive into it, go right ahead though.
No, I mean, let's see. Chrome, yeah, after it was the add-in there. So the add-in, if it is a one-to-one device, it's just that add-in there. But depending on your actual scenario, where it isn't failing, is the user log actually registered with that device in Azure AD?
Yeah, so I think the scenario we're running into is partially my own fault from testing, is that I log in with one account, but then I have multiple profiles that I log in with different accounts, and it was those different accounts I just noticed that the partial device info was showing up. If I look at the account that I was actually logging onto the machine as, it was showing up just fine.
Yeah, and that is exactly related to the PRT, and that's due to shared computers don't do it very well.
You see that with Citrix as well?
I haven't tested.
Is non-persistent. Is that actually going to show up, or as
Dennis, I'm sorry, your mic is. Dennis, the mic is really quiet.
Oh, this is probably better.
Oh yeah, much better. I can hear now.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was wondering if you would see that same type of scenario with Citrix, where you're using like non-persistent sessions. Because I was testing with that with some of the, and it was using the device's Azure hybrid joined or compliant. And the Citrix sessions fail, but obviously my primary asset was working correctly.
Honestly, so I haven't done too much around Citrix of trying to
Okay.
make that work. And the reason I haven't is because Citrix, because we have a very designated IP range, that would be
Yep.
usually I've done a trusted location that excludes it.
Yeah, and that's
because of that
where I
issue.
was headed down. So I was just wondering if, because you talked about that profile and the device registration, it seems like a high candidate for having that same issue.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's what it is. I haven't done too much testing on Citrix. I have a few colleagues that have, that are definitely way more involved with that type of VDI configuration. Persistence, a different story, of course, because the user gets registered to it when they log in as their primary there.
Yeah, they'd be, I mean, that's
But
more a
non-persistent,
dedicated image.
Non-persistent, I would expect to run into an issue. At least if you don't want them to MFA every time they connect to it.
Well, and I was even thinking our scenario is conditional access into cloud app security to do like block download from unmanaged devices. Well, those Citrix devices, right? If there's not a good way to identify them, well, then we'd have to exclude them based on IP address.
Pretty much at the moment. The only other thing I'm wondering is, well, it's non-persistent. There's not a good way to add everybody's account that's using a single device. So if it was shared by a few users, you could add multiple accounts that would register when they log in. But even at that point, that's a little difficult and extreme to try and do.
Okay. And then I'll elaborate on, I was just wondering, where you set a conditional access policy in your Senate to read only, if there is a way not to go look at users, but to be able to do a filter and say, well, show me everybody that hit this filter or hit this conditional access policy.
I've seen, see, I want to say so some of these reports on overviews, I haven't tied conditional access into any log analytics. Guessing again, I could do that with sign-in logs if I put it to log analytics because it's ingesting all the data fields.
Okay.
If there's somebody on here that's done that, feel free to come on and mention that because that's definitely part of what I enjoy about these sessions. But if we're looking at this, we could look at, again, all enable policies or find more of the read-only. Where are they? If my browser would actually stop adjusting things. But this would, this would help filter it at least. So this, if we could select that policy from the top level under the overview, coverage and monitoring. So again, monitoring policy evaluated, should be able to specify our policy here. So if we know which one's going to be in report only, this doesn't tell me which ones are at the very bottom on the screen here. If I let go, it's going to jump it back up, sadly. But the very bottom one, this MFA, like if you see that option, it says select individual reported only policies or report only policies.
Okay.
So we could look at that then and see what's applied. And then if we select there, it should bring us to the users that were covered by that. Additionally, if we look at coverage and want to review any of the apps that it's hitting, it gives us a decent summary here. Again, I've been pretty happy with where this has come. That might be the easiest way to review it though, that I'm aware of.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to stop the discussion, but perhaps we should do the drawing here, at least for the people. So I've got.
Aren't you giving that to me?
I am giving it to you. Actually, you are the winner, Doug Wilson. Actually, no, I'm not. Again, it is. I'm going to put this slide up real quick just to make sure everybody knows it's there.
Go ahead. My share.
Make sure that you go and take the survey so you can not only comment on Doug and what a wonderful job he did there, but also get a chance to win a Surface Go 3, which is our grand prize today. We'll also be giving away a $25 gift certificate to one of the lucky people in this session. And I have it put into the wheel generator, and I'm going to spin it and see who wins. Here, let's find out. Our winner is Tom de Molinaire. Is that how you pronounce your name, Tom? I will put you on I'm going to give this to our folks, and we'll contact you via the registration information that you submitted.
All right.
And
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for coming, and make sure you fill out your survey. The least you can do for that one, and we'll take it from there. Thanks everybody for coming. I want to do, I'm sure you've seen this slide plenty of times. All these people, all these companies actually do a lot here to make sure that these things happen and that we're able to give away these things and do this stuff and keep it free for everybody. And I think you guys have to agree it's probably the best value in training that's out there these days. So thank you guys all for coming, and also go out to, if you're not on YouTube, go out to our YouTube channel, Minnesota M365 user group, and subscribe and sponsor. We will be posting all of the session videos that we've been recording out there within the next week or so. So check that out. And thanks a lot. Anything else you want to say, Doug, before we
Yeah, I was
before
going to
we let
offer,
you
if
go?
anybody wanted to stay, if anybody still had questions or wanted to chat through anything, please let me know. I can stay on here for another 5 minutes or so. I'm in my home office here, so I'm not really having to drive through traffic right now. I might just step away and grab a beer, and that's about it.
You just can't get enough talking about this stuff, can you, Doug?
My wife's not home at the moment. I'm good.
Oh,
Go ahead. We can end the recording as well, Ted, if you
I
don't
will
mind.
do that. I will do that.
Less BS to cut out from me.
Yep. Stop recording. All right.